The United States is the most powerful nation in the history of the world in terms of its influence and in terms of its military might. A big reason for this is the economic power that the United States has exhibited. Initially, the idea of American expansion and the idea of the American dream was directly tied to its territorial ambitions. Think about the Manifest Destiny or the Louisiana Purchase or the Oregon Trail. But by the late 19th century, the idea of America as the land of opportunity also included great innovations. While America had always had great inventors, think Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who were prominent founders of the country, the Gilded Age, which was post-Civil War, really saw this expand in a major way. Obviously, the ideas of the Gilded Age are very popular these days because of the TV show and the fact that there were many industrialists like Rockefeller, Carnegie, or the Vanderbilts who had wealth larger than even history's greatest monarchs. But aside from the class dynamics, the innovation and the inventions of the time had a very long-lasting and generally positive effect for the country. Today we're going to focus on the man that really was the quintessence of American innovation during this time, and has also been a symbol of innovation for so many that followed him. I'm Will Henry, and this is Quotable History.
Mary had a little lamb, it's quite a soul.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Quotable History.
Here's today's quote. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece as white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. All right, so normally here we pause and I challenge you to guess who said this, but today we're actually not going to do that because today's focus isn't really on who originally said this. As you probably know, this is a classic nursery rhyme, probably from the early 1800s, at its origins earlier than what our focus is today. But this nursery rhyme was the first quote ever recorded by Thomas Edison on the original phonograph.
The first words I spoke in the original phonograph. A little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
Now, what you just heard was actually him talking about the invention and his first words he said in it in a 1920s recording. However, I like to play this recording just to give you a sense of what he sounded like and how he sounded in this recording. As you can also probably tell, this is the first quote in our Quotable History theme. Obviously, this is a very important moment in the history of the recording industry, in the history of podcasts, and the history of audio in general. This was also Edison's favorite invention, which he really called his baby, largely due to the fact that hearing was a real struggle for him for the better part of his life. So, who was Thomas Edison, the man? Edison was born in 1847. His father was a Canadian political activist and expatriate to the United States, and his mom was a respected school teacher. He suffered from some hearing struggles early in life due to some lasting effects from scarlet fever. He was a very hyperactive student early in life, and some sources say that I found that he only attended school for 12 weeks. However, other sources say that he was kind of in and out of different schools throughout his childhood. He was primarily taught by his mother, who really helped him excel and really taught him the value of self-learning. He really learned well on his own, which is a skill that he carried with him for the rest of his life. This just shows that the super aggravating kid in your class may one day excel and invent a device that everyone uses every day. Then again, he just may be annoying, so you pick. By the age of 12, Edison had a job selling newspapers to customers of the Grand Trunk Railroad line. He used this access to news bulletins that were teletyped to the station every day to start his own newspaper, the Grand Trunk Herald. This really showed an entrepreneurial spirit from an early age that would last for the rest of his life. Edison also used his job at the railway to make a makeshift chemical lab, which is, I know, something that everybody did when they were a kid. But this time, it ended up being a disaster and actually caught one of the train cars on fire. A very angry conductor struck him in the head, which probably caused further hearing loss, and actually kicked him off the train. This forced him to sell newspapers in the stations along the route rather than actually on the train. At the age of 15, while working at the railroad, Edison saved a child from an oncoming train. As a reward for that, the child's father taught him to operate a telegraph, which was a very valuable skill at the time. This provided expanded economic opportunities as he became an itinerant telegrapher throughout the Midwest, subbing for those who had gone to the Civil War. He was not able to go to the Civil War because he was too young. After the war, he took a full-time job working the telegraph at the Associated Press during the overnight shift. However, due to the changes in technology, which really would require good hearing, he ended up being unable to continue in this line of work due to no longer being competitive in that field. To add to his struggles, his mom was having serious mental health issues, and his dad didn't have a job. So he was forced to get a job at the Western Union Company in Boston, which was the science and culture center at the time. During this time, his interest in inventing would really begin. He would invent and get a patent for one of the first electronic voting machines, which ended up being rejected, but he would make it anyway. His first major invention, though, came in 1869, which was an improved stock ticker called the Universal Stock Printer. And this used alphanumeric characters as opposed to Morse code, and it also happened to be a lot faster. So you were able to get stock values a lot faster than what they previously had been able to. He was paid $40,000 in 1869 for the rights to this invention, and he used this money to develop a lab in Newark, New Jersey. After this, he would marry 16-year-old Mary Sitwell in 1871, who would die at the age of 29 in 1884. He then would marry Mina Miller, who was 19 years younger than him, and both wives would give him 3 children each for a total of 6 kids. Edison expanded invention operations in Menlo Park, New Jersey, which is where a lot of our story is going to take place. And he would form different partnerships with different companies. However, most of the time, the work would just go to the highest bidder. While he would never be as wealthy as, say, a Carnegie or a Rockefeller, he was an intense capitalist and entrepreneur with a strong desire to build things. He even created a much more advanced telegraph in 1876, the same year that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. These would serve distinct purposes, though the Western Union Company did desire for Edison to create a competing product from Bell's telephone. However, this never was developed. In 1877 came the central event of our quote today, the invention of the phonograph. He did this by using 10 coated cylinders with 2 needles, one for recording and one for playback. While it would take a very long time for the phonograph to be used commercially, this invention was really the first to bring Edison to legendary status. His most famous invention, however, would not come until 1879, and it really wasn't totally his. The electric light bulb had been really imagined for a while, and most of the framework and concepts had already been well in the works. English inventor Humphrey Davy invented the electric arc lamp in the early 19th century. Another group of inventors named Henry Woodworth and Matthew Evans would then patent a design for the electric light bulb, though it would not really work all that well, and it couldn't be distributed for widespread use. Edison then would buy their expired patent and improve upon it and file for his own patent, making his own electric light bulb, which allowed for widespread commercial use in 1879. Though to call him the sole inventor of the light bulb would be misleading. However, without him, the light bulb would have definitely been delayed in terms of widespread commercial use. Out of this invention, he would establish the Edison Illuminating Company, which would eventually become General Electric. Edison at this point would primarily focus on becoming a business manager. He would move from being an inventor to a business manager for lighting and electric business ventures. He would not find as much success with this as being an inventor, which I think is an important lesson for corporations and for companies and for individuals. That just because you're really good at one thing, just because you're a solid inventor or a good individual contributor, this doesn't make you an excellent manager. Edison was also engaged in what is now known as the famous Current Wars, which was a battle that he had with fellow inventor Nikola Tesla and businessman George Westinghouse. Tesla had worked for Edison, but would resign due to some severe disagreements. Tesla was a brilliant engineer, and he came up with a much more efficient way to use electricity with his alternating current as opposed to Edison's direct current. If we are thinking about electricity as a track, a direct current moves in one direction, where an alternating current will occasionally reverse. This is a lot cheaper, it saves on power, and this can change voltages easily. This is why we call electric cars Teslas and not Edison. But Edison hated his competition and would spread all sorts of misinformation about the alternating current in order to really prove a point, even executing animals to show that it wasn't safe, which is a very dark side to a very publicly celebrated man. Fun fact, to kind of get a vibe for this, Christopher Nolan's film The Prestige is largely an analogy to the War of the Currents. I should clear up one story. There was a story that I read about when I was a kid, and it's a very famous story about Topsy the elephant. Topsy the elephant was ordered to be executed by electricity. There's been a misconception for years that this was orchestrated by Edison when his motion picture came out. This is not supported by the timeline or the facts, as the War of the Currents had essentially cooled off by the time this had all happened. Essentially what had happened was that Topsy the elephant was deemed a dangerous elephant and was ordered to be put down by the Animal Control of New York City. A company founded by Edison, though not under his direct control, did provide the electricity, and his company that he was running at the time did produce a documentary about the event. However, Edison was not directly involved with this event. It was due to his involvement on the filming side that really has caused the confusion over the years. Is a more sinister motivation for putting this movie out possible? Yes, but that's not something that's immediately evident by the available historical evidence. Edison and his associates would later invent the motion picture, which would become a major part of the rest of his career, as we saw from this example. It could be said with his invention of the phonograph and the motion picture that he is the most responsible individual for modern entertainment. Not only now was it possible to hear events that had already happened, but now we could see events that could already happen. That will change a culture. That's enough to change a culture. Now, to be fair, he and his companies were brutal competitors in the film industry, which is why a lot of people who were pioneers in the film industry moved from New Jersey to California, which is why California is really the hub of all movie making. It was to get away from their crazy grandpa of sorts. But he does deserve credit for his contributions. Edison would die in 1931 due to complications from diabetes. And so what can be said about his legacy? By the time Edison died, he received 1,093 patents, most of which were unsuccessful or abandoned. Around 500 to 600 were unsuccessful or abandoned. However, part of what Edison was known for is his intense perseverance. Now, Edison was a horrible boss, he was a brutal competitor, and he was an egoist. As I mentioned earlier, he was so brutal to the film industry that he forced them to move across the country. In order to show alternating currents were dangerous, he would go so far as to execute stray animals. His war against Tesla is actually one of the greatest rivalry stories ever. So, Edison's legacy is very mixed, but his accomplishments and his inventions sprung America into a new age of innovation. He not only is responsible for giving us things like the light bulb or the phonograph, which is very well known, but he also changed the culture by giving us motion pictures. He allowed us to hear and see things that had already taken place. This is a man who really changed the way that everything was done. He was one of the greatest American innovators. I'm Will Henry, and thank you for listening. Big thanks to my wife, Rachel Henry, for editing this episode. Her hard work behind the scenes really made this podcast possible. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow me on social media for more content. All the links are in the description below, so check that out. And don't miss next week's episode, because we're going to introduce something new, something exciting that we're going to add to Quotable History that you won't want to miss. Until next week, I'm Will Henry. Thank you for listening.